fortunate to get approval of our dear author Mustafa Akyol to hold discussion on his book and have him with us. We are also very lucky to have a wonderful panel with us. I welcome all of our panel members, Sir A.K. Muneer Sahab, Madam Amber Ahmed, and Brother Fawaz Shaheen. So, before I request our experts to share their remarks, observations, thoughts, and reflections on the book, let me tell you in brief what this book is all about without giving any my own comment here, as we will listen that in detail from our experts. So the format of the discussion is that we'll request all our speakers, discussants to give their remarks, share their thoughts on the book. And then finally, we will listen the author, his response to the comments and his concluding remarks. Uh, the author believes that even though the current developments and advancement in liberty and freedom took place in modern liberal West, but it has strong seeds and precedents in Islamic civilization and Islamic texts. It shows how there are verses and instances of liberty and freedom in Quran and Islamic history. At the same time, he also points out the issues where liberty and freedom is violated in interpretation of the text or in practice and in tradition. So, not to take longer time, I would humbly request our first speaker, Dr. A.K. Muneer Sahab, to share with us his thoughts and remarks on the book. A.K. Muneer Sahab is Assistant Professor of English Literature in Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Anthropology of literature, comparative literature, cultural studies are among his thirst areas. So now I would humbly request our dear Professor A.K. Muneer Sahab.
Thank you, Zulkarnain. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can hear.
Thank you, SIU and all the organizers for putting this event together and extending an invitation to me. I'm very glad that this forum has given me the opportunity to read Mustafa Akyol's well-written book on Islam and liberty. So, like any reader, I'm also kind of caught between this aporia of reading, as the literary critic Hillis Miller once said, that is reading a text sympathetically with some kind of childlike innocence by trying to get inside the book and to feel the texture of that book and so on. And also, at the same time, trying to read the book suspiciously by trying to offer a critique of the book, by trying to read the book against the grain. So, like everyone else here, I'm also kind of caught up between this aporia. Okay, so I'll try to do both and as much as I can. So first, the book's argument, as the author himself puts it in a nutshell in the book at the beginning, is basically that the argument is that Islam and liberty, or liberty, is compatible with Islam, right? And one can find a strong, solid basis for such an argument in Islam itself, right? And liberty understood as the absence of coercive constraint, which is one way of looking at freedom, negatively. And I think I'm sure we are all familiar with these two kinds of freedom in liberalism, in the discourse on liberty, that is negative and positive freedom. So this way of understanding liberty as something that is absent, or the absence of coercive constraint, is what we usually take to be negative freedom. So liberty understood in this sense is compatible with Islam, and one can find one can base this on verses in the Quran and such as the famous like Rahiya verse like Rahifuddin qad tabayyana ar-rushd min al-ghayy, and the author makes a very good argument, a very strong argument for liberty, or he makes a very strong case for liberty on the basis of that ayah or verse in the Quran. And one can also similarly find other verses in the Quran where Islam does not um, ask its followers to force anybody to accept the faith. So, for example, there is another verse which goes like, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ, right? That you don't guide all those whom you like, but it is God who guides whom he wills, and so on. And at the same time, there is also another famous verse in the Quran which reads, um, "Ud'u ila sabil rabbika bil hikmati wal mau'izati al hasana," right? That you should invite people to your faith, Islam, bil hikmah and al mau'izati al hasana, with good advice and so on. So, in a sense, this is a very familiar argument, and also I would say very intuitive, right? Intuitive in the sense that Islam, in all represented in when we present Islam generally, we all make this case for liberty in Islam. That is to say, we always popularly and also in scholarly discourses, we say that Islam is a religion of peace, Islam is a religion of compassion, Islam is a religion of of, of liberty, and so on and so forth. Although sometimes in a very qualified way when it comes to freedom, and that is something that we need to discuss while trying to read Mustafa Akyol's book. So, is Islam and liberty compatible with each other? In a straightforward sense, one can say that okay, there are elements of liberty in Islam, but the question that I want to pose here for ourselves is that how do we understand liberty? Is liberty merely a personal ethic or an individual virtue, such that it is something that people practice quite freely and voluntarily and so on? Or is liberty also some kind of discourse, right? Some kind of discourse of power, which entails certain kinds of sensibilities, certain kinds of approaches to what it means to be a Muslim, and so on and so forth. So there are two things that I want to flag here. That is one, liberty or liberalism, because in the book we can see that there is a sliding between liberty and liberalism, because liberty is understood to be a very core value of liberalism itself. So I'm also using these two words now a little interchangeably. Now, before we move on, I think the question here is not whether one is for liberty or not. That is, are we pro-liberty or are we against liberty, whether Muslims or not, right? That way of framing the debate would not help us to understand what is actually at stake in the discourse on liberty. And why is it that it's not always very easy to say that Islam and liberalism, go hand in hand? Or why should even one say that Islam and liberalism should go hand in hand, right? So that actually involves a lot more complicated questions, more complicated, that involves a more complicated situation. So first, I wanted to say that following the lead of scholars who have recently worked on secularism, liberalism, individual rights, and so on, all of which are one can say, very strong, very fundamental principles of liberalism as we understand it. We cannot understand liberalism merely as a personal ethic. We should also understand the liberalism as some kind of discourse of power, right? Now, when we say that, let's talk about this too. When we say that liberalism is also a discourse of power, it means that liberalism as an idea or as a doctrine also presupposes, certain kind of certain kind of being in the world, right? Certain kind of subjectivities, right? Certain kind of approaches that one should have towards religion, towards tradition, towards reason, and so on and so forth. So, in that sense, liberalism is not simply, or liberty for that matter, it's not simply a personal ethic or an individual virtue, but also a discourse of power. And in that, and if we look at liberalism from that perspective, can we say Islam is actually compatible with liberalism or not? Right? So the question is a little more complicated than an understanding of liberty as a personal ethic allows. Right? Of course, one can find principles, seeds of, as the author himself puts it, seeds of liberty in Islam. But when we understand liberalism as a discourse of power, which actually entails or endorses certain kinds of being in the world, certain kind of approach that one should have towards religion or tradition, certain kind of valorization of reason or scientific rationality, and so on and so forth, or in other words, the valorizing or privileging the very idea of individual autonomy, which lies at the core of liberalism as we understand it. When we look at liberalism from that perspective, is it valid? Is it safe or wise to say whether to say whether Islam to say that Islam is compatible with liberty or liberalism or not? There, I think one will have to pose. We'll have to pose over this question and try to unpack what actually lies. What are the assumptions that actually undergird liberalism in this sense, in the sense of liberal, in the sense of a political, in the sense of a discourse of power. So, like I just mentioned, what lies at the heart of liberalism as we understand it is the individual autonomy. And when we think about what it means to be a Muslim, I think there's some tension occurs between this idea of individual autonomy and what it means to be a Muslim, right? At least in the way some Muslims understand what their religion to be. Okay, we cannot talk about every Muslim. Islam is cannot be understood in a monolithic fashion. So therefore, at least from what is usually glossed as a traditionalist, quote unquote, Muslims point of view, right? There happens to be some kind of tension between this individual autonomy and the kind of submission that Islam actually demands from people to tradition or to some kind of authority, and so on. So one important concept in Islam is that of ubudiyya, right? Ubudiyya, that is everybody is the slave of God, right? The God is master and everyone else is his slave, right? Even the Prophet is described in the Quran as Abuduhu wa Rasuluhu, right? The Prophet is Abuduhu wa Rasuluhu at the same time, right? Abud and Rasul. Ubudiyya is a concept that is so central to Islam, and it's captured by the very meaning of Islam as submission to the will of God. Um, so, and also in the very concept of taqwa, right? Taqwa, or which is erroneously translated as piety. The actual meaning, which the scholars um, um, attribute to that word, is that in Arabic, imtithalu awamirillahi wajtinabu nawahi, right? Imtithalu awamirillah, that is to obey God's commandments or commands, and at the same time, wajtinabu nawahi, and eschewing his prohibitions, right? This is how traditional scholars have defined taqwa. Um, um, that is imtithalu awamirillah, obeying God's commands, and wajtinabu nawahi, that is eschewing his prohibitions, right? Now, when we understand what it means to be a Muslim in that sense, there arises some kind of tension between the liberal principle of individual autonomy and the kind of ubudiyya, the kind of ubudiyya, the kind of servitude that Islam demands from a person, from an individual, right? Although that relationship exists between the God and the individual, yet that understanding has further implications, right? It this ubudiyya, although it is a relationship between God and a Muslim or an individual, this concept has a further implication such that it also affects the way a Muslim conducts his or her life on a daily basis, right? Because the point is to obey the God's commands and to keep from to avoid God's prohibitions, right? So that itself limits the idea of the individual autonomy or the autonomous, freewheeling agent or self that lies at the core of liberalism. So this is very important because understanding this nuance is very important because the kind of subject that liberalism endorses or advances is one who is self-owning, right? The person who owns himself, and that's when he can make his choice, right? Somebody who is free to act. But at least for some Muslims, or I don't want to say majority or minority, there are Muslims who believe that that is not the case, right? For them, the subject is actually dispossessed in transcendence, right? The subject is dispossessed in transcendence, such that there is nothing that, according to them, that they choose or according to their interest or their will, or and so on, because they are actually enjoined. They believe that they are actually enjoined. In fact, they are kind of constrained to believe in a particular fashion, and also to conduct their affairs in life in a particular fashion, right? So what is the kind of religious subjectivity that liberalism endorses is a question that I think I would like the author of the book also to elaborate upon, right? Because it is only when we think about liberalism in that sense, is it a kind of a free-feeling discourse that everyone can pick up, without it having any bearing on the way one conducts his or her life on a daily basis? Absolutely not, right? Secularism or tolerance, religious tolerance, and ideas or principles like that, which are very central to liberalism, they cannot be understood simply as personal virtues or individual ethics. They should also be understood as a particular kind of discourse which involves very unequal power relations, right? And this is very evident in the way traditional Muslims are kind of ridiculed or kind of derided by liberals, simply because according to them, these Muslims, they uphold a tradition which is centuries old, and simply because they don't give due importance to reason and so on, according to many liberals. Now, why is this happening? This is happening because there is a tension, there is actually a disjunction between the kinds of subjectivities that both these approaches, both these ways of being in the world actually uphold. That is to say, from a liberal perspective, I would argue uh, it is not possible for us to understand what a traditional Muslim thinks or believes or what he or she does, right? Because at the center of liberalism lies this view of subject as somebody who is self-owning, whereas for traditional Muslims, quote unquote traditional Muslims, um, um, the subject is not somebody who owns themselves, but rather it is somebody who is dispossessed in transcendence, as I just pointed out a while ago. Okay, so let me now turn to a discussion of this point by the cultural anthropologist Sabah Mahmood in her book, in her work on politics of Islamic Reformation. I'm not referring to her book, Politics of Piety, but rather an article that she wrote in Public Culture, which is on the politics of Islamic Reformation. So there, she is talking about how the U.S. government is hell bent on reforming Islam or reshaping Islam such that Muslims would kind of they would grow up to value liberal principles or Western values and so on and so forth. Now, there, what is actually at the heart of the problem is some kind of hermeneutics or a particular way in which traditional Muslims interpret the scripture, the Quran, the Hadith, and so on and so forth, right? She calls it scriptural hermeneutics. Now, the US government and many other state funded, state supported corporations, such as RAND Corporation, RAND, RAND Corporation, and so on, they have prepared a lot of reports on what is actually that is holding Muslim back. What is actually preventing Muslims from upholding liberal values and so on and so forth. And in one such report, which Mahmood quotes in her work on the politics of Islamic Reformation, is the report by the RAND Corporation, where they criticize the traditionalist Muslims for their belief in the divinity of the Quran and a failure to regard it as a historical document. Okay, these are the chart. These are what the report criticizes the Muslims for, right? And second, the Muslims' failure to realize that Muhammad was a product of his time, whose life offers little of practical value to solving the exigencies of modern existence. right? And this is of otherwise sometimes also presented as a call to historicize Islam, right? Historicize the Quran, historicize the Prophet, Hadith tradition, and so on, right? Which often comes from the liberal uh, fold, right? And third, the RAND report says the inability of these Muslims, of course, they're talking about not liberal Muslims, but traditional quote unquote Muslims, right? Their inability or failure to denounce the juristic tradition for its deficient and contradictory character. And this is relevant to our discussion of this book because in the book also the author has focused on how to reform the Sharia or what is it that we should revive from the Sharia and so on. So this is a familiar familiar motif in liberal discourse to reform the Sharia and to reform the Sharia in accord with liberal principles. That is something that we have to take note of. Reforming the Sharia in line with liberal principles. Now, there is always some kind of power relationship that exists here. We never ask the question as to why aren't we reforming liberalism in accord with Islamic principles, right? The question is always posed in one particular way. That is to say, always Islam has this burden. Islam has this burden of proving its compatibility with liberalism. Why is it so, right? Islam has this burden, or Muslims carry the burden of proving Islam's compatibility with liberalism, not the other way around, right? We never ask this question as to why is it not that liberalism, or even secularism for that matter, secularism as a principle of liberalism, right? Why is it that liberalism also needs to remake itself or to rethink itself or reform itself in line with uh, Islamic principles or Islamic ways of being in the world and so on and so forth. So that is why I said liberalism is not kind of an innocent project, an innocent idea that somebody can pick up, right, without its having any implications for the way in which one lives his life in this world, right? Because there are um, some kind of asymmetrical power relationship existing between these categories, and therefore one needs to pay attention to such unequal power relations. Otherwise we will end up kind of talking about liberalism and Islam in a very idealized manner without actually attending to the problems that lie at the heart of such a proposition. So uh, Zulkarnain,
Yeah, please conclude now.
okay. So there are different forms of life. I mean, there is a word that author himself uses in the book, that is human flourishing, and this is a phrase that we also have learned from the moral philosopher Alsdair MacIntyre, right? Human flourishing. Now, does human flourishing, does liberalism exhaust human flourishing? Is liberalism the only way in which one can live in this world meaningfully? It's a question that we need to think through, right? I don't think liberalism is the only way in which human flourishing can be understood. In fact, liberalism excludes several kinds of ways of being in this world. For example, in its antipathy towards in its antipathy towards traditionalism, so-called traditionalism, right? Liberalism is actually overlooking um, an important um, uh, part of an important aspect of human flourishing, as several people have actualized it or realized it in this world. And also, we cannot equate traditionalism always with this very dangerous or very dangerous phrases like they're all fascists, they're all dangerous people. Not really, right? Most of these traditional Muslims, they do not concern about capturing the world or conquering the world or hatching any plot against the US and so on and so forth. They are not interested in those things. They are actually interested in conducting their daily life in accord with what they think or believe is proper Islamic conduct, right? Or in other words, they are interested in cultivating taqwa. Taqwa, as I put it earlier, imtithalu awamirillahi wajtinabu nawahi, obeying commands of God and also keeping away from God's prohibition. So there are ordinary Muslims, millions of them, right? Many of, I mean, we all are familiar with those Muslims in our own neighborhood, in our own little back of beyond and so on. They cannot be ridiculed, or they cannot be taken to task, right, for failing to appreciate or for failing to understand or for failing to uphold what we, the enlightened Lord, consider to be the proper or the more enlightened, modern or way of living in this world. So to conclude, I would like to ask, I'm not answering this question, but I would like to ask, throw up a question here. Do we need to defend liberty as a Muslim, or do we need to defend liberalism as a Muslim? Right? Especially liberalism understood as a discourse of power, right? Which endorses a certain kind of being in this world, certain kinds of subjectivities and so on, certain kinds of sensibilities, right? Certain kinds of conceptions of who we are, right? Self-owning subjects. And similar, concomitant dispositions and so on. Do we need to defend liberty, first of all? And secondly, whose question is this anyway? Is this the question for every Muslim? Is this the question that is meaningful for all Muslims? Or where is this question coming from? Right? So I stop here and thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear Dr. A.K. Muneer Sahab, for such a wonderful discussion and for sharing your important remarks on the book. Now, moving ahead, I would request Amber Ahmed to share her views and her thoughts on the book. So, Amber Ahmed is associate professor in Delhi University, and she teaches political science at Kamala Nehru College. Her primary areas of interest include political theory, religion, and feminist politics, intersection between faith and feminism, etc. So, very humbly, I would request Madam Amber Ahmed to please share your thoughts on the book.
Thank you, Zulkarnain Saab. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to start by saying that this book was eminently lucid, accessible, and it made for compelling reading. So you have written in a manner, sir, that it is something that is very comprehensible, even when dealing with fairly complex concepts. And that for somebody in the academia is usually a novelty. So it really made for compelling reading. The author has made a compelling argument in favor of liberty and against coercion, arguing that liberty is compatible with Islam and that it is an ideal to be revered rather than to be reviled. There are some arguments of his that in particular struck a note with me, and they are very significant ones. First of all, one in particular was that we need to revive an understanding of the law as a law which is above all, which is applicable to all, and no one, whether it is a mighty ruler or a lowly subject, no one is exempt from it. This is a point that is definitely worth reiterating, especially if we look at the state of the so-called Muslim states that we have across the world. And he has pitched it as Sharia as a law that derives from God and is therefore above everyone. Sharia is a check on arbitrary power. This is a powerful idea, and it is in opposition to the notion that the word of the prince is the law. Whatever the prince says, whatever the ruler says constitutes the law, or rather that there's no rule of law as such. The prince seems to be, or the ruler seems to be above the law. Contrary to that is the notion that the law is above everybody else and invoking the notion of the rule of law. So this was one idea that resonated. The second one was a very significant idea, that of envisioning political communities based on recognizing the rights of non-Muslims to practice their faith without fear or hindrance. So the author draws upon the Prophet's settlement in Medina and the treaty with the Jews to highlight many important aspects of a civil community. So these were 2 points I wanted to highlight. But there are some discomforts that I want to also share here. First of all, I think we need to problematize the terms that we are using. So as Muneer Sahab has just pointed out, when we speak about the term liberty, it is an essentially contested concept, not just in terms of the difference within liberalism between negative and positive liberty, but also how liberty can be conceptualized in many, many different ways. For instance, I would also like to draw upon Sabah Mahmood's work. So when she speaks about how somehow it's almost as if, the liberal secular discourse has developed a monopoly over the discourse, over the concept of liberty. And more often than not, liberty is projected as individual agency in the face of opposition. Liberty is associated with agency, and agency itself seems to lie in resistance. Right. I find interesting Sabah Mahmood's work where she reconceptualizes liberty. She talks about liberty and agency in very different ways. She talks about how agency does not always necessarily lie in resistance. It can very well also lie in inhabiting norms. And so that's one thing. Other than that, we need to also problematize the term liberalism. When we are speaking about liberalism, it is a mansion with many rooms, but in particular, I would like to draw attention to certain things here. One is that liberalism, like for example, the author has referred to John Locke in context of his seminal work, Letter Concerning Toleration, which is, of course, very significant in building up any argument relating tolerance in society. And yet, I think it is important to excavate the fact and state that Locke, while he was perfectly tolerant of multiple kinds of Protestantism, he wasn't particularly tolerant about atheism or Catholicism. He was very clear about that. He believed that the Catholics would owe their political allegiance to Rome, which is, of course, so it was like contrary to the political sovereignty, almost like that. And also, atheism is something that he was not willing to condone. He was not willing to be tolerant about. So the liberal history that we draw upon to build arguments of tolerance, or the whole notion of liberalism as a very tolerant discourse, I think there are all these other aspects that we also need to look at. Another person, that is John Stuart Mill, whose harm principle is referred to by the author, that if I am putting this correctly, that when it comes to self-regarding actions, John Stuart Mill was in favor of maximum possible liberty for the individual, and that an individual should not be constrained on the grounds that he or she is harming his own self, his or her own self, and it is only justifiable to place constraints or limits on an individual's liberty in the event that their actions have a detrimental impact and adverse impact upon others. Now, this entire idea of self-regarding actions draws from the abstract individualism, which is the bedrock of liberalism. There is something like you're looking at the abstract atomized individual. Can there truly be actions that are completely self-regarding? That's a question that requires discussion here. Can any action be considered truly self-regarding when human beings are already implicated from the moment of their birth within a social setting, within interrelationships, etc.? Also, I think since the question is about liberty, and we are talking about self-regarding actions, and if we take John Stuart Mill to his logical conclusion, to what degree are we then going to go, assuming that there are self-regarding actions, that to what degree are we willing to go in upholding the individual's right to choose? So then by that logic, euthanasia, right, which I do not think is exactly compatible with the Islamic understanding of one's control over one's own life. Euthanasia is also about the individual's choice. So is, according to certain discourses, the right of women to choose sex work if that is what they wish to do so, because they are considered to have autonomy over their bodies in terms of what they choose to do with it. So these are important questions, I believe. I also want to highlight that when we speak about liberalism, there is a very fundamental assumption that is implicit, that somewhere the self-interested actions undertaken by multiple individuals, all of them pursuing self-interest and making rational choices, that this is all somehow going to result in some kind of a good society, some kind of balance. I mean, particularly if you look at it in context of economy, classical liberal ideas focused on this notion that the millions of self-interested individuals are ultimately going to create an efficient market that is going to be governed by the invisible hand. So there is this implied economic rationality as well. So when capitalism is also presented, right, as a version of liberty, and yes, the author has talked about how it is not a capitalism untempered with other notions. So there is, of course, the understanding of he's talked extensively about the responsibility of charity. He has talked about zakat, but I think there is a more fundamental issue here. It is not just a question about capitalism, the free market as trading and so on, and along with that you have sadqa and charity and you have zakat and so on. That's not the point. The point is somewhere the economic rationality that is implicit in liberalism and capitalism. I think at this point of time, we really have come to a point where we need to question it. For example, it is the self-interested actions of millions of individuals over a period of time that have brought us to an ecological crisis today. So in that sense, we cannot make an automatic assumption that individual actions or self-interested individuals who are left free, who are at liberty to choose, will always lead to the best possible outcomes that we can think of. One more thing about liberalism before I move forward, and that is, Muneer Sahab also raised the point about secularism, but in relation to the liberal understanding of secularism, there is something that I want to talk about from something that Talal Asad has said. So he says, and I'm just reading out a bit and I'll tell you where I'm quoting. Talal Asad argues that, give me one moment, please. I've lost the page. Just give me one moment. Right. Talal Asad basically talks about how it is not just, when we speak about the secular, it is not just a separation from religion. It is not as simple as that. On the relationship between the notion of the religious and the secular, Asad has argued that secularism as a political doctrine is closely related to the formation of the religious itself as the other of a religious order. He says that it is precisely in a secular state, which is supposed to be totally separated from religion, that it is essential for the state law to define again and again what genuine religion is and where its boundaries should properly be. Modern politics cannot really be separated from religion, with religion having its own sphere and its own politics. The impact of the Enlightenment did not simply lead to the subordination of religion to the state or to the confinement of the former to the private sphere, but also the simultaneous production of religion as a new historical object. And now I quote from Asad directly: anchored in personal experience, expressible as belief statements, dependent on private institutions, and practiced in one's spare time. This construction of religion ensures that it is part of what is inessential to our common politics, economy, science, and morality. We need to problematize all these terms, whether it is liberal, whether it is liberty, whether it is secularism. And also, I believe that we need to problematize the term Islam. Islam is not a monolith, right? Because of the immense heterogeneity within the fold of Islam, I think there has to be some sensitivity to that as well within our public discourses. Because, for instance, not all Islamic schools of jurisprudence refer to qiyas. And so it cannot simply be expressed as, just one more undisputed way of deriving Sharia. So we need to problematize that when we are speaking about Islam, right, there are multiple versions of Islam. Which Islam are we referring to? My second discomfort after like the need for problematization, I have some discomfort with how the Quranic verses have been used in a particular narrative. For example, the verse that Muneer Sahab also referred to, like Rahafiddin. What is essentially, it appeared to me that what is essentially a verse regarding freedom of belief, because faith, Iman, and Ikhlas can never be forced. The heart, when it submits, it cannot be forced to submit. It appears as if it is being presented as a verse in favor of freedom of action rather than freedom of belief. If someone chooses to not pray or not fast or perform Hajj despite having the means to do so, how do we interpret that? What meaning do we attach to it? Do we see this as the freedom to believe in a version of Islam that does not enjoin these obligations upon the believers? Is it that one can say that I do not believe that Salat is important or required? Or do we see this as a Muslim who's deficient in practice, which is admittedly a matter between the individual and Allah? It doesn't require any third person's intervention, I agree. So is it a question of freedom for Muslims to be deficient with a recognition that it is a deficiency, or to reinterpret Islam itself as per individual requirements of conveniences of practice? The freedom that we exercise in obeying or not obeying, right? Let's not even get into the territory of that which is disputed, things that are absolutely clear. Is it like, for example, Salat and so on? I'm by no means saying that anybody has any business forcing somebody to do Salat or forcing somebody to fast. That's not the point. What I'm asking is a simple question. The freedom that we exercise in obeying or not obeying, right? Obviously, I mean, it's not as if I will suddenly be inflicted with divine punishment if I miss my prayers. So in that sense, I am free, whether I'm praying or not praying. But the freedom that we exercise in obeying or not obeying, is it deriving from ikhtiyar, free will, which is a prerequisite for any spiritual progress? Or is it freedom that can be traceable back to like Rahafiddin? That's one question. Second verse that has been used is the verse number 59 of Surah Nisa, the verse regarding obedience. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu atiyullaha wa atiyur rasul wa ulil amri minkum. Regarding this verse, the author has reached a conclusion that this verse stands abrogated because he believes that the ulul amr do not exist. Now, I hear this is something that left me very uncomfortable, because it appeared to be a case of cutting the coat to fit the cloth. Because just the automatic assumption that the ulul amr do not exist is something that I find problematic. Of course, there are disputes within different branches, like between different sects of Islam regarding who exactly are the Ulil Amr. One of the positions, the one that I adhere to as a Shia Muslim, is one that the Ulil Amr do exist, and they exist in form of the Imams, something that the author has also quoted. Here, let me also state one more thing. There is a very strong element of what Weber had called disenchantment that we see around us, that a stripping of the religion of those elements that appear to be, otherworldly or irrational and so on. Now, so I think somewhere we need to ask ourselves this question that, for example, we do believe as Muslims that the Prophet Isa is alive. We do believe as Muslims that the Prophet Khizr is alive. So by that logic, if I have a belief that there is a Sahib-e Amr, there is a Wali-e Amr that I believe in strongly, I find myself uncomfortable with the notion that because somebody does not, how could I say it, does not find a satisfactory Wali-e Amr, it becomes easy to say that the verse itself stands abrogated. That's highly problematic from my perspective. Another argument that, like another thing that I would like to state is, and which is that I have I've come across many places in which there is an almost uncritical celebration of the of what is supposedly the golden period of Islam, which is the Abbasi Caliphate, the Abbasids, and Baghdad as a supposed center of learning. I'm sure all of that must have been there, very much so, and great strides may have been made. But what I find missing in these discourses, especially if there is a talk about liberty, is that these were also regimes that were fairly despotic, and these were also regimes that when it came to the question of sectarian differences, engaged in multiple genocides. So the Hassani Sayyids, for instance, were massacred in Baghdad, so under the Abbasid Caliph. So an uncritical celebration of these regimes as as upkeepers of rationality and wisdom and debate and knowledge promotion and so on is something I think we need to sort of rethink a bit. Finally, I'm not going to take more time because this is something that Muneer Sahab has already stated far more eloquently than I could ever hope to do so. But there is a certain liberal humanism at the center of this book, and humanism is invariably focuses on temporal existence, while Ubudiyya or Bandagi focuses on the transcendent. So what does Bandagi imply for human autonomy? Are we masters of our own selves? Are we masters of our own choices? Are we masters of our own bodies, capabilities, etc.? To what degree? And I'm asking this question in relation to Ubudiyya and not in relation to purely in terms of human interrelationships. So to conclude, it is true that belief cannot be compelled by outward force. I also agree that cloistered virtue is no virtue, and forced expressions of piety are empty and meaningless. It's not piety at all. But at the same time, as a Muslim, I'm not very convinced by the philosophical premise used, which is making Islam compatible with liberalism and the way in which Quranic verses have been invoked. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambar Ahmed. Thank you so much for adding your important remarks and making this discussion very wonderful and meaningful. So moving ahead now, I would request very humbly dear brother Fawaz Shaheen to share his thoughts and remarks on the book. Fawaz Shaheen is the National Secretary of SIO, Students Islamic Organization of India, and he is currently doing research in JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. So I would humbly request our brother Fawaz Shaheen Saab to share his thoughts.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, brother Zulkarnain, and also thank you to the speakers who came before me. A lot of the concerns that the things that I wanted to say have already been said, particularly by Madam Ambar Ahmed, and so I won't be repeating them. And especially thank you to Mustafa Akyol for joining this discussion. Before we get into it, and I'll try not to take too much time, but it's important to acknowledge that this book discussion has excited a lot of controversy and conversation, which we don't usually see around book just not just the book, but holding this particular discussion. And a lot of that has to do with the issues that are not directly related to the book as well. But still, I think there is a question of why we are having this conversation today. And in a larger sense, what Dr. Muneer was saying, whose question is the question of liberty? And is it the question of common Muslims everywhere? Is liberty our question? And I do believe very emphatically that it is a question for all Muslims, because if you just look at India, you can look at the global scenario also, but if you just look at our particular context, we are facing, on the one hand, we are fighting against, we're facing a situation where every day we are seeing more and more hate speech. We're seeing increasingly genocidal calls against Indian Muslims. And on the other hand, we are fighting off an increasingly authoritarian government intent on silencing us and on invisibilizing the practice of our faith, of our religion. And so in that context, when we defend our right, when we defend our right to pray, when we defend our religious practice and our right to speak about our religion, our right to present dawah, we have to be sure why we are doing. When we talk about the freedom of religion, we have to remember that we're not just talking about the narrow sectarian interest of the Muslim community in India. As an Islamic movement, as members of an Islamic movement, as Muslims and people concerned with the Islamic faith, we have to always remember that we hold certain universal values. And when we defend freedom of religion, when we defend our rights, that has to be in, that has to be in the context of our universal ideas of liberty. And so these discussions are important. I'm not saying that there is any uncritical acceptance of any one view, and certainly not of the view, no uncritical acceptance of the view presented by Mustafa Akyol in his book. But these are conversations which need to happen so that we can clarify and assert what our universal ideas of freedom, or whatever, what are our universal ideas because of which we are resisting the authoritarian onslaught against us. So I believe that discussion and conversation is very important right now. And having said that, when I started reading this book, what I appreciated the most was its clarification of what liberalism is not, or what liberalism shouldn't be taken to be, because the Islamic world has a long history of the whole jargon of liberalism, the whole discourse of the whole narrative of liberalism being brought by colonial oppressors or by local rulers who are ultimately authoritarian, who force secular or nationalist ideas down our throats. And Mustafa Akyol confronts that head on. In this book, he takes apart, with equal tenacity, secular authoritarianism, and he asserts how the Islamic world had actually seen a tradition of debate, of engagement, of trying to, when confronted with modernity, when confronted with European ideas, the Islamic world produced a number of thinkers, a number of reformers who were trying to deal with these very questions. But those conversations were frequently interrupted either by colonial imposition or by local authoritarian rule that was, again, mostly supported by some foreign power or the other. And when we talk about liberalism, when we talk about reform, we do not mean the liberalism that is brought in by colonial imposition. So that clarification, and not just a clarification, in fact, it almost on a polemical level, a rejection of that kind of forced secularization. I think that is very important to begin with, just to acknowledge that what we are talking about is not just a response to a dominant idea. It is not subjugation to what is current today. In fact, what we are trying is to discover our universal ideas in the contemporary milieu. And in that sense, my disappointment with the book is that even though it acknowledges the baggage of liberalism, it and it also goes very, it tries to establish, or it tries to show the Islamic sources of liberalism, or as the author says, the Quranic seeds of freedom, and of the idea of freedom, of how hurriyat develops as an idea, or what the author says la ikrahiyya could have developed as an idea. So while it talks about those things, it fails to extract liberalism from its own long baggage, because ultimately these are ideas that we attribute to a particular historical setting. And now we know there is significant research, there is significant work that tries to show how liberalism in Europe is also not just a European product. And there is a lot of work which talks about how medieval European thinkers were actually interacting with with various cultures around the world, particularly Native American cultures, and what the liberal idea, or the ideas of liberalism, or the ideas of freedom, and of the absence of coercive restraint that they saw in many tribal societies that they dubbed as primitive societies, how interaction and dialogue with those ideas contributed to the production of this of the Enlightenment, contributed to the development of Enlightenment ideals. And similarly, similarly with democracy, we often take it as, the Westminster democracy being the origin of democracy. But now, we know, and there is significant research on how the idea of participatory governance, of participation, consultation, and contract as the basis of governance, is a much older idea than, in fact, it is an idea that is found in almost all cultures at their early stages. And so, in a way, an argument can be built. And I look to scholars like Mustafa Akyol to actually build the argument of how there are certain freedom, certain ideas of freedom are actually found in our fitra, are found in our nature. And that is, to that extent, those ideals are also found in Islam, because Islam is the Deen-e-Fitrat. And if we remove the Eurocentric, baggage of liberalism, only then we can try to build our own conception of liberalism, our own conception of freedom. I think this book tries to do it in certain ways, but it also falls short. And I believe that is some conversation that we need to have on that front. But mainly my discomfort with this book was its almost uncritical acceptance of capitalism, and especially the capitalist ideas that we, because the book presents an argument of how Islam encouraged free commerce, of how Islamic civilization created a free trade route, a place where business could flourish, and how in many ways that actually gave Europe the instruments, the financial instruments, the concepts that led to modern day capitalism. But I think there is a fair bit of misreading here, because it is one thing to say that Islam encourages commerce and encourages free enterprise, which is exactly true. Islam is not a state. Islam does not envision a statist, much less a communist economy in any way. But Islam is also not, it would be very wrong to say that Islam is actually endorsing what capitalism is today, or even, because capitalism is born in a post-industrial revolution. It is born in a particular historical setting, and we know that free trade, that when we say we are trying to encourage free trade in the world, it's not actually the freedom of trade. Free trade comes with its own baggage, where we have it has created a system that has enabled huge monopolies in critical sectors, in health, in education, in infrastructure. It has created these huge monopolies. And when we say that we want to encourage free trade, we know that third world countries are required to tweak their policies, required to tweak their domestic laws to suit a certain kind of capital, a certain kind of capitalist idea. And whether Islam has that same idea of capitalism or that same idea of commerce, I think that is extremely questionable. What we cannot also deny is that capitalism at its root has an extractive history, because the corporation, this book also talks about how the joint stock company or joint ventures gave birth to the idea of a corporation and of corporate legal entities. But the corporation that Europe saw at its beginning, whether it was the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, it has a everywhere that it went, it actually curtailed free trade or the freedom of commerce. Everywhere that it went, it forcefully created where it couldn't get a monopoly, it forced a monopoly on the point of a gun, and it actually destroyed free trade. And I think the starkest example is that the economic system that the Islamic civilization gave birth to, created a world where Europe was also facilitated in coming out of its dark ages and coming out of its economic backwardness into prosperity. But the economic system that capitalism has created today has given birth to a world where the global south is effectively looted of all its resources. So those are histories that we have to acknowledge and that we cannot be uncritical of. And Mustafa Akyol almost ridicules the idea of an Islamic economics. And it's true that this is an idea that's almost in its infancy even today. And even if we say that there can be no Islamic economics, we still need to distinguish that Islam has certain ideas of economics that are distinct from what we see in capitalism today. A very basic question would be, would an Islamic economic system, or would an economic system which is based on Islamic ethics allow the creation of a company like Amazon, or would it, that creates its business at the expense of, that creates a monopoly at the expense of free trade, actually, at the expense of the freedom of commerce. So this kind of assertion that Islam, the economic ideas of Islam are just capitalism with a few ethical constraints, I think that is a little unfounded. And also it's an oversimplification. And if we are to actually talk about the economic system, whether or not we believe there is an Islamic economics or not, there is an economic system and an economic idea that Islam gave rise to, certainly, because it talks about commerce, it talks about trade, it gives primacy to contract, it protects property. But at the same time, you will see that, in this whole chapter, for instance, there was a discussion on many things, but I was surprised that there was no discussion on inheritance. Capitalism could develop in Europe in large part because of the existence of primogeniture, the idea that all land and property goes to the firstborn son. Whereas the Islamic system of inheritance, whatever the disagreements or nuances, it constantly seeks to break up large holdings of property. It constantly seeks to establish redistribution of wealth, not redistribution in the socialist sense of taking monopoly control over the economy, but redistribution in the sense of constantly circulating wealth among the people, breaking up large holdings in every generation. That is why, we can see that, we can find in the Islamic world awqaf that date back centuries, but you'll very rarely find land holdings that go back 1,000 years or so. But in England especially, and in other parts of Europe, you will find hereditary lords and huge landowners whose estates actually go back centuries. So that difference, which there is, I'm just trying to highlight, there is a very real difference between the capitalism that we see today and what Islam envisages as a healthy economic system, whether or not we call it an Islamic economic system. So that kind of uncritical acceptance, of capitalism does make one uncomfortable. And before concluding, this brings me to the larger point of how the debate over liberty, this initiative for reform, is often framed. The idea that Islam is in need of a reform, or in the same way that the Christian world underwent a reform post-Enlightenment. And while the intentions may be noble, first of all, it's very ahistorical, because the European context where the Enlightenment happened, that context was free from foreign subjugation, from foreign occupation. But what we see in the Islamic world today, the baggage that Mustafa Akyol himself has acknowledged, we cannot remove that, we cannot forget that baggage when we start to talk about reform. And so when we frame our efforts at reform in this way, that this is an attempt to bring about an Islamic enlightenment in the same way that Christianity had an enlightenment, it not only sounds ahistorical, which it is, but it also, unnecessarily gives credence to conspiratorial ideas, conspiratorial theories. So instead of, that kind of framing, I believe if we go back to some strands which Mustafa Akyol's previous book actually, talking about reason and talking about how Islam has certain universal values, and if we try to frame our argument, and if we not just frame our argument, actually extract our argument from those universal ideas instead of framing it in these kind of ahistorical terms, I think the process of reform and the effort of reform would go much further and free of many of the conspiratorial controversies that surround all discussions of liberalism and reform. So thank you. I've already exceeded my time. There is lots more to say, but I'll end here and over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Fawaz bhai. Thank you so much for such a wonderful discussion. Now it's time to go and listen to the author of the book, Mustafa Akyol. But before that, I would like to share some of my thoughts and views on the book. So in very brief, though I know I don't deserve to participate in the panel in the people who have just spoken, but still, so first point, one point which I observed generally in the whole book repeatedly was the use of Islamist or Islamism. So whenever the author used Islamist or Islamism, so it always carried a negative tone, kind of humiliation or ridiculation or contempt. So we know, like Islamist or Islamism are so loose terms which conflate so different and sometimes drastically different and opposite elements in the same degree. So ignoring the nuances and complexity and diversity in the group which we loosely label as Islamist or Islamism. So even though, for example, many of the arguments or many of the notions which the author brought in terms of apostasy, for example, stoning and whatever, so we might find many of the views in the scholars which in fact belong to the group which we roughly call Islamist. And the second point, you, while talking about the problems which are there in the interpretation of the Sharia, you talked about corporal punishments, and you try to contextualize it in terms of like Quran's immediate context by saying that that was the only way. But is this claim true? Because there are mentions of different types of punishments in Quran itself. So, for example, imprisonment is also mentioned there, the one which liberals normally and you are also promoting and advocating for. Even at the same time, financial penalties are also there in the Quran, what we call kafara and whatever. So is it right claim or argument that was the only punishment available in that immediate context, and that's why Quran used that punishments and now we can replace, for example? And secondly, why can't we look on the whole issue of punishment from a different perspective of from the liberalism, for example? So the problem which we arise in this corporal punishment, that this is physical pain and this shouldn't be done. So, but for example, the alternative what we have is imprisonment. But by imprisonment, we punish relatives of the criminals much more than criminal himself. So criminal, we give him the prison, for example. But the psychological pain and psychological punishment that we are giving to close relatives of that criminal is something we can think about it while discussing the whole discussion of punishment. And also one thing was pointed out by Madam Ambar Ahmed is the verse where you talked about the sovereignty or what it's called, ulul amr, ulul amr. But I get the problem there that you wanted to abrogate the verse completely, is that you took the meaning of ulul amr in absolute authority. While if you see there in the verse, so there is a very deep and indication which differentiate between the two different kinds of ita'atullah, ita'atul rasul, and then ita'atul ulil amr, which is not absolute authority. Rather, this is something which is questionable authority, which we deal with, engage with, and which is based on the shura. So if we relate, for example, ulil amr with the amruhum shura, two verse together, so we see it's not about the thing which you and me perhaps agree to deny, which is divinely authority, or which is divinely sovereignty. So I guess that verse is not talking about. So, and finally, just as many have also discussed it, why not to use terms which are more friendly for our context, our religion, our language, our memory, and our history, for example. So we saw for public criticism or public critique, Talal Asad brought the notion of nasiha, which he stressed is stronger and richer than the public criticism which is talked about in European context. So you also mentioned somewhere, I guess, this the concept of nasiha as public critique. So while you yourself realize the psychological effects of the whole discussion, and also that the baggage which the notion like liberalism and all this carry, why can't we think of some other language, some other concepts which are more friendly for our tradition? So by saying all, and again, thank you all of the speakers. And now I would like to request very humbly our author, Mustafa Akyol, please.
Thank you so much, Jazakallah khairan, and I really appreciate all this attention given to my book. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, and I truly appreciate the attention by Dr. Muneer, Dr. Ambar Ahmed, our sister, and Fawaz Shaheen, and Zulkarnain, and you as well. And I appreciate you organizing this event. I've seen online that some people were unhappy, so I'm glad that you stick with your decision. And just want to clarify, some of the people who said, "Oh, he's denying hadiths." I'm not, astaghfirullah, denying hadith. That is authentic from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I just subscribe to the view that the classical collections we have may need some further questioning and evaluation. And I subscribe to the view, for example, that I can suggest a book. I mean, a Pakistani scholar, actually, Israr Ahmed Khan, has a book, Authentication of Hadith, Redefining the Criteria, a book that has influenced me, and there's a whole literature on this. So we are deeply respectful as a Muslim to Quran and the Sunnah, but the question is every authentic hadith classified as sahih, should be unquestionably accepted or not? So that's a fiqhi question, but I subscribe to that view. Just to clarify this. Now, for today's discussion, I would, first of all, I mean, there were many points raised by our colleagues here. I'll sometimes combine them, sometimes I'll go one by one. I would like to emphasize one thing, for especially people who are here listening to us today. My book addresses some of the questions we just discussed in the past 1 hour and a half. I mean, for example, Dr. Muneer raised a lot that, is there a discourse of power? Is this a Western manipulation? Dr. Sabah Mahmood, she passed away, and she wrote about the US government promoting liberalism. So there is a colonial agenda behind this. I mean, I address that in the book, and just to emphasize, I'll explain a bit more now, but there's a chapter, the last chapter of the book is titled, Is Liberty a Western Conspiracy? And I do show that, yes, Western governments have promoted liberalism or liberty, or sometimes use it as a pretext for their colonial agendas, beginning from the French invasion of France back in the early 19th century to the US occupation of Iraq in 2003. But I said, this is one part of the picture. Then I show Muslim liberals in terms of Muslim defenders of Hurriya, people like Namik Kemal from the Ottoman Empire, or Hayrettin al-Tunusi from Tunisia in the 19th century, embracing the idea of freedom in the sense of a limited government, freedom of the press, democratic rule, political representation, what we call liberal democracy basically today, and looking at it from an Islamic point of view and criticizing Western colonialism as well. And they use liberty to condemn Western colonialism as well, because Western ideas of freedom which allows freedom of the press within the West and so on and so forth are something different from brutal occupation and colonialism, which the West did, which the Russians did, which the Chinese do. I mean, every power in the world does that. So we should be able to distinguish that. One more thing, do Western governments promote liberal ideas, liberalism, and so on and so forth? They do, especially after 9/11. If you look into the near history, you will see that the British was very sympathetic to Wahhabism in the early 20th century, because they thought it was helpful against the Ottoman and Caliphate, which they were at the time fighting against. If you look into the 80s, United States was supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, who were not liberals, right? They were Mujahideen. They were not Taliban, but ultimately they were armed groups acting in the name of Islam. They were launching jihad, and US found them helpful to its political design or goals at the time, which was fighting the Soviet Union. What I want to say is that Western governments or other governments, Russian governments or others, can look into the Muslim world and they can find this or that group as helpful to their ideas or goals at that point, which is something we should be aware of. But that in itself doesn't negate. I don't see that Wahhabism is a British conspiracy or something like that, although some people actually think like that. I mean, it's at some point it helped and they support it. And so I just want to make that clear that there are some Western narratives about these issues. I address that in the book, and I show how the West at times used the idea of liberty, freedom, women's rights as a pretext for colonial expeditions, colonial invasions, and justifications of their colonial project. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak about the rights of women in the Muslim world. And in the chapter about why we need to rethink the Sharia, I begin with the story of a lady in Pakistan who was first raped, then because of a misapplication of Islamic laws, she was put on trial for actually committing zina. Luckily, she was saved, but she spent a lot of time in jail. So there has been cases like that. Now, I'm sure Western governments or NGOs especially, or media, showed attention to this issue at the time. They said, this is too bad. Was there a reason for Muslims to say, there's no problem, because the West is talking about this, we should not talk about this? No, it is a problem for our women, for our sisters there who gone through that problem, the ordeal. So I believe that we Muslims should not imitate the West, be fancy admirers of the West, as a lot of people have done in my country, Turkey, for example. On the other hand, we should not obsess with the West in a sense that we will deny everything they say, or whatever they speak about something, we have to be on the other side. If they say freedom, we have to reject freedom. If they say democracy, we have to reject democracy. No, and we should understand that the West is a complicated civilization, as our Islamic civilization. So Western governments might there have own goals and ambitions and their quite hypocritical policies. On the other hand, there might be principled Western NGOs criticizing Western governments as well for their hypocrisies and really upholding human rights. And these are the people who would defend, for example, Muslims in India against militant Hindutva fascism that is threatening Muslim minorities, for example. And I'm also happy to see from Fawaz Shaheen, he said, he reminded India in the beginning, why we Muslims need freedom. Well, we need freedom from groups like those groups who want to threaten Indian Muslims in the name of Hindu supremacism, right? They think beef is, in their religious tradition, is haram. They don't use that term, obviously, but, and they want to punish Muslims for eating beef. So we need freedom, that is religious freedom, for Indian Muslims to defend against such attacks on Muslims. We need religious freedom to stand up against China's ongoing genocidal persecution of our Uyghur brothers and sisters in India. So Which brings me to this discussion on the meaning of liberty. In the book, actually, I don't speak much about liberalism, but liberty. And yes, every concept has different interpretations and this and that, but it doesn't mean we can't give a meaning to it and define it and discuss it. I mean, justice can be understood in many ways, but we have and we should have meaningful discussions on the meaning of justice and Islam. So I see liberty that way, and yes, I define it as the absence of coercion, that is negative freedom. That's true. So I say that in the beginning, and I say, how does our Islamic tradition relate to that? One thing, a point that Dr. Muneer do I say it right? Is that correct, or is it longer? Sorry.
Yeah, it's A.K. Muneer.
Dr. A.K. Muneer. He said liberalism, or this liberal idea of liberty, let's say, comes with a sense of individual autonomy. Whereas Islam teaches us submission, right? I mean, ubudiyya, that is, Islam means submission to God. I agree. But I will say, you need individual autonomy so that your submission is meaningful. In other words, freedom is the basis you need so that your Muslimness is purely for the sake of God. In other words, you need a society which will not impose on you any religious practice or the lack thereof. So you will choose to, with your individual autonomy, you will choose to submit to God and be a good Muslim. Like, here's an example. Just let's speak through examples. Like, imagine it's Ramadan and, Muslims are, we are supposed to fast, and that's our religious obligation. In other words, in Ramadan, we give up our freedom, right, to eat during the day or drink water. But do we do this because we want to worship and honor God and do what is farz for us according to our religion with our free choice? Or also, is there a religion police force coming and checking if we are eating or not, and if we eat in the public square, comes punishes us? Now, the second thing is I'm criticizing, and I'm saying we need freedom, la ikraha fi din, which is a Quranic maxim that I see as a maxim. We need that so that our religiosity is meaningful. So therefore, I mean, other people will use their liberty for other things. They will be Hindus or Christians, they will be atheists, maybe they will be people who are hedonistic, who live a life of, and we as Muslims, we might have our reservations about that. That's very normal. But we use our freedom precisely to be good Muslims, and that's what makes it more meaningful and more precious to be a Muslim, a practicing Muslim. Now, if we don't do this, and if we say, yes, of course, you should do it out of the will to honor God and worship, but there should be some coercion. There should be Hisba forces, religious policing, for example. For example, on checking women's dress code, right? On whether people eat in Ramadan, or there's time for prayer, go to the mosque. Some people, they did it in Saudi Arabia, now they're cutting back on that, although they are doing other terrible things like punishing journalists who criticize the ruler. Or like Taliban government. I mean, if you coerce people to practice Islam, I think there you start to undermine freedom. And is this good for our religion? I think not, for two reasons. This leads to hypocrisy, not true piety. We see that in Iran. We see that in Saudi Arabia. Actually, my book begins with the story of how I went to Saudi Arabia. I saw a woman getting on the plane with all hijab, even niqab, and some of them come to Istanbul, and I saw them going back and changing into a very different dress code, right? Which means you're not creating piety here. You're just creating hypocrisy. And maybe even you creating a detestment, a really rejection of religion in their hearts, which we see in Iran very clearly. When Iran imposed religious practices for 40 years, Iranian Republic made Iranian society very secular. Everybody who goes to Iran, observes society in that sense, says that there are polls showing that a lot of Iranians have become secular because their resentment against the regime unfortunately turned against religion. So for both sincerity in religion, and also for actually making people not to detest religion, for the sake of religion, I think we should emphasize freedom. Now, do we have a problem with this regarding our Islamic tradition? In the chapter, Why We Need to Rethink the Sharia, I touch upon that. Yes, we have some ideas of coercion and hisbah, but I argue that, and I argued more in detail in my other books, but this book was a short treatise in some of the basic points. I think these are historical interpretations. They don't come from the immutable sources of Islam, that is the Quran and the undisputed Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So these are our traditional ulama interpreted fiqh according to their times and norms. I understand that, I respect that, but I think these coercive measures come from interpretations that we can question today and change today, because we see the bad consequences of it. And we should not forget that human society changes, human aspirations change. Maybe there was less interest in human individual liberty 1,000 years ago, but there's more today. We have a different human state, a different culture in the modern era, which is not possible to roll back. So it is important that we base religion on the la ikraha fi din, no compulsion principle. And in my book, I show a Turkish imam who says, no, there is compulsion in religion. So that we have an issue here that we have to discuss. He says there is no compulsion to religion, but there is compulsion in religion, which means we will not force you to become Muslim, but if you're Muslim, you will be coerced to observe Islam. And I think the coercion to observe requirements of Islam should come from our faith, not from the government or society or a religion police force. Also, let's not forget that when we say we will coerce or at least encourage society to observe Islam, in practice, this will mean in every society, what is being forced will be the interpretation of Islam of that particular group or sect that controls that society. In Iran, it's Shia Islam, right? I mean, if you go to Saudi Arabia, what's being imposed on you is the Wahhabi Islam. So, Taliban does its own thing. So, and can you say, well, I disagree with you, Taliban. I mean, my fiqh is different. Well, but if you make your fiqh the law of the land imposed on everybody, there's also that sort of coercion. And in traditional Islamic societies, this problem wasn't there much because you could have different fiqhs in one, the Ottoman Empire, in the Abbasids, and so on and so forth. But we live in centralized states. That's a fact of modern life. So I think when you make one fiqh, one jurisprudence, the law of the land, you also have the coercion, the imposition of one interpretation of Islam over others. That's why, and here's where this liberalism comes from. Liberalism, John Lockean liberalism, which was very minimal and limited, as Dr. Ambar very kindly put. I mean, John Locke said we should tolerate other Protestants, which was a very new idea at the time. He was a little bit skeptical about Catholics and atheists. That's true. Although there are different writings of John Locke, some people think, he moved forward. But John Locke initiated the idea of religious freedom. After John Locke, others completed this, like people like Roger Williams in the US, which led to the US Constitution of Bill of Rights and the Constitution and religious freedom and so on and so forth. I am not calling our fellow Muslims to let's go and buy everything Locke says and let's embrace it, and so forth. I'm just saying, let's think why the Europeans did this, why they had this shift towards liberalism. Because they had their own terrible history with coercion and violence in the name of religion. And it was much worse than what we have. I mean, look into 17th century Europe. Protestants and Catholics were killing each other in the middle of Europe. There's San Bartolomeo massacre in France that Protestants were slaughtered in the streets, 30 Years' War. And Europeans were also killing each other out of sect, and they were punishing heretics. One of the people they killed for heresy was Servetus, who was a Christian theologian who questioned the doctrine of Trinity. He actually said things that are close to our belief in unity of God, Tawhid. He was killed as a heretic in Geneva by the orders of Calvin, and Protestants were not very liberal in the beginning. So people like John Locke, being Christians but being horrified by all this violence and intolerance in the name of religion, they said, Can we have a different political order where the government will not impose one doctrine, but will just say everybody has rights, and the government will just protect their rights and let people follow the churches they want so they can be free in their religious practice? Also, the king doesn't have divine rights, but the government doesn't have divine rights. The government should be responsible to the people. So the beginnings of the idea of democracy and representation and limited government and so on and so forth. So I think liberalism was the pill the Europeans developed, or the medicine the Europeans developed for their own problems in their religious understanding. Now, I think we don't have the exact same problems, but we have some similar problems. And especially they become more clear when we come to the modern age. That's why I'm not calling Muslims to I speak of John Locke, not that John Locke will be our sheikh or imam or something. I'm just saying John Locke, well, he did something in Christianity which helped the Christians. They stopped killing each other for religion. They don't bomb each other's churches, or they don't think. And I mean, there are different groups, but generally the idea that religious freedom is a good thing. Now, in Europe, what happened though, especially in France, liberalism also included an anti-religious bigotry, because particularly in France, the Catholic Church was very dominant and it was allied with the monarchy, and which was authoritarian. I'm certainly very critical of that anti-religious strain in European thought, which unfortunately influenced a lot of people in our civilization. In Turkey, my country, I mean, Kemalism, and we can, being a Turk, let me say a few things to you about Turkey. I mean, Turkey was actually inspired by the classical liberal ideas of people like John Locke in the late Ottoman Empire, which gave us the Ottoman Constitution. People like Mehmet Kemal, they reconciled Shura and democracy, and they were trying to create an Islamic liberalism, and they were critical of Western policy, of course, and colonialism. What later happened is that during the beginning of the Republic, a different line to control of Turkey, and that was a line represented by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Turkey's founder. We call it Kemalism. It was not liberal. It was secular and authoritarian. So it closed down madrasas. It closed down religious institutions. It forced men to give up the fez and wear the hat. It's the most ridiculous hat reform that we had in 1925. Ultimately, it interfered in the hijab of Muslim women in Turkey. The hijab was banned in Turkey, in the campuses, in public governments. Now, I'll tell you one thing. I discovered liberalism as a Muslim who's so angry at all these impositions on the religious sphere in Turkey by the Kemalists. When I was in college in Turkey in the 1990s, there was the ban on hijab on Turkish campuses. At the beginning, there were policemen at the door of the campus. I called them secularism police. They would check if you're wearing a hijab, you had to take your hijab off. Now, this was secular Kemalism, and of course, the Islamic part of Turkish society was very angry with this, but they couldn't do anything. It was the whole state, bureaucracy, military, judiciary. They were all one together. It was a Kemalist regime. You know who opposed this ban besides religious people themselves? Liberals. They said every woman has the right to decide her clothes, right? What she will wear. The government doesn't have the right to dictate to people what they will wear. So Turkish liberals sided with the hijabi Turkish ladies to protest against the secular authoritarian regime. And honestly, that was 90s. That was my interest in liberalism. I said, why these people are standing up for religious freedom of the Muslims? Oh, it says, I mean, I was in Boğaziçi. I was already studying religious, besides my religious upbringing, I was studying the Western liberal tradition and so on and so forth because of my classes, but that's the beginning of it. So that's why, let me emphasize. I'm not, when I speak of freedom, I'm not speaking of freedom from religion, although some people may take it that way. I'm also speaking and I'm emphasizing freedom of religion, that we should have the right to be religious in the way we want, and the government and the society should not dictate to us. And that's the basis of our piety, and that's sincerity, ikhlas. And that's why I think liberty, that there's no tension. That's why I think between the idea of individual autonomy and submission to God, our ubudiyah, because we need that freedom first to practice our ubudiyah and to live through it really with sincerity. Of course, Some people will say, oh, my individual autonomy, I will use my individual autonomy to be a hedonist, and I will live the life of just pleasure and no religious. Well, that's their choice. And we may proclaim our religion, we can try to share our faith, but some people will choose the other way. And it's everybody's imtihan. That's their test. I mean, a test is a life is a trial, and everybody will be tested by God in this life, and they have the right to make choices that we think are not correct. Coming back to some of the, which brings us to the individual, I mean, mil harm principle. Like, what is the limits that? I mean, there will be people, let's say, atheists in Muslim society. They're atheists. I mean, they live that way. They think that's the right way. They write their books and maybe even propagate their ideas. I think they should have the right to do that. Or they can be impious people. You know, they can live a life that is not Islamically legitimate. And I think they have the right to do it. Unless they harm us, we are not going to interfere in their lifestyle, unless they come and harm our way of life. And that is a kind of also political consensus you need ultimately, because you cannot think that the whole world will be Islamic, right? I mean, even in what you call Muslim majority societies, some people are more pious, some people are less, and that's the way it is. And there are actually verses in the Quran which says, I mean, people will not believe in God. Most people will not believe in God, and most people will not believe in God without shirk. So not that everybody in the world will be pious, good Muslims. Some will be, and we should aspire to be one of those, but it's okay that some people are not. And that's why we should have civil measures to proclaim our religion, to share our religion, maybe to attract to our people, to our religion, to our particular religious understanding. And they should be able to have their own views, and I think that's fine. And unless they harm us, unless they interfere in our way of life, interfere in the way of life of Muslims. That's the balance you need in India, right? I mean, there are Hindu supremacists who are trying to interfere in the lifestyle of Muslims, who are demonizing them, and against them, that's the liberalism you need, is what you need in India to preserve the religious freedom of Muslims. That's why I think Indian Muslims stood up for the secular constitution in the past few years in their protests. Because if the constitution goes towards a Hindutva supremacist, or if the political order goes towards that direction, that will be obviously destructive. One thing is France that comes up a lot. Our friends who are critical of liberalism generally point to France. They say, is this your liberalism? Take it. You know, they are also interfering in hijabs. And well, France is not a good example. France is not a good example of the liberal tradition I'm speaking about. And that's why if you look into US, for example, US defenders of religious freedom, they are generally critical of France as well. And it is being emphasized historically that in the US, freedom means freedom of religion. In France, it means freedom from religion. So France has its own problems, and I'm very critical of those, and I've written a lot on French secularism, and that's not the model we're talking about. And that's why, and liberalism is, by the way, not a good term in France. Generally, they laïcité, you know, state, republic, they value those notions more. Now, coming to some of the other topics, let me just check. And the liberals deride traditional Muslims. That's what Dr. Muneer AK said. Well, again, there are people who goes by the name liberal in the Muslim world. And I think by that term, sometimes people mean someone who doesn't believe in Islam and who drinks wine and who doesn't care about religion and, you know, who is westernized in their lifestyle. I mean, that's a pejorative term. A liberal, as I define it, is somebody who defends hurriya, and that is religious freedom, and that will be respectful to different ways of life. There can be secular people who are really ugly and oppressive, and we have them in Turkey. I mean, the hardline Kemalists in Turkey, I've never been a fan of those, and this book actually includes a lot of criticisms towards those people as well. So this is what I can say on this whole idea of that there is the Western imposition, discourse of power. My last chapter in the book, I think, addresses that. I would recommend people to check that part. I'll come to some of the issues on Ulul Amr. Well, on the chapter on Ulul Amr, I didn't say, and I don't have an authority to say, I didn't say it's abrogated, right? Naskh, I didn't use that term. I said it ceased to be applicable. And I showed the example of the verses about the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There are verses in the Quran about Prophet's wives, that how they should behave, and there should be a curtain between them and others. But another verse says, you are not like other women. So, or for example, there's a verse which says Muslims cannot marry them after the Prophet. So Prophet's wives were there for a generation, and we don't have the wives of Prophet alive anymore. So those words are not applicable just because time changed and because of generations and so on and so forth. And on the Ulul Amr, I refer to an early tafsir by Muqatil bin Sulaiman, who said this was about a particular incident. There are that interpretations of Islam. And I just entertain that, saying that this could be one way to understand this. I don't have to issue any abrogation at all. I don't have that authority. I'm not sympathetic to abrogation doctrine at all, by the way. But some verses, there are verses in the Quran that's about slavery. They're not applicable today because there's no slavery. And I think it's a good thing that there's no slavery today. In the past 2 centuries, slavery has been eradicated. And how that happened is a different story. But I think it's important. So there can be verses in the Quran that can be looking into that particular situation. That's true for some of the verses in Surah Al-Tawbah that, about the mushrikun who signed a treaty with the Muslims, and when the forbidden months are passed, go and attack them. Well, that was a historical episode. It's not applicable in every society. So I entertain the idea that the Ulul Amr can be some concept like that, and I refer to an early tafsir who understood it this way. And again, this is one way of looking into this, because I think the alternative is everybody becomes Ulul Amr. In every state, in every society. Yes, we have Shura, and Ulul Amr can ask a few consultations to some people around him, but if you think that there should be somebody you should obey religiously, who is that person? It's the head of every Jama'at, it's the head of every Muslim state. It is that my interpretation, my own personal interpretation, going through Ulul Amr experiences, at the end I said, well, I'm just obeying God and his book and respect the Prophet, but I don't see any Ulul Amr today. That's one way of looking into it. Of course, our scholars can disagree. I'm not praising the golden age of Islam. There were despotic states, yes. Umayyads were pretty despotic, Abbasid most of the time, and even Caliph al-Ma'mun that I mentioned positively in the book had an institution called Mihna, which was a terrible imposition of doctrine on Imam Ahmad Hanbal. Although I would actually sympathize with some of the Mu'tazila theology there, I think the imposition of that was dead wrong. So there is no golden age in the sense that this was the best, or like, for example, I speak about the Ottoman Empire generally positively in the book. I speak about how Ottoman sultans were constrained by power, but there are terrible things in Ottoman history. Ottomans justified murder of brothers in the dynasty, for example, and it was not from the Sharia, but they thought it was accordingly. If one of the Ottoman princes, Sheikhzadeh, as we call them, become the sultan, he had the right to kill others so they don't create fitna. Right, so that led to murders in the Ottoman family. So that was a terrible thing in Ottoman history. So, and there has been oppression of Alavis, brutal oppression of Alavis during the times with the. So there are many things, but what I do in the book is to say, well, listen, what these Westerners are saying about liberty and all that. Well, we actually had that. We had a glimpse of that, and we were even better at that, right? In terms of religious freedom, actually, until a few centuries, Islamic world was much better than Europe. When John Locke was writing his book, Letter Concerning Toleration, the Ottoman Empire was already close to a John Lockean ideal. You could be a Christian or a Jew or a Greek Armenian in the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire would not force you to convert. So what I'm saying is that we had these ideas, and I'm just showing glimpses of it. And what was the greatness of the classical Islamic era? One thing was it was open and economically dynamic, open to different ideas, engaging with Greek philosophy, refuting it, but also buying some parts of it or integrating parts of it, which helped develop our Islamic jurisprudence, at least logic, for example, came from the Greeks. So I'm just trying to give snippets of historical episodes which can help us think anew on these issues. And I'm not exhaustive in all of these chapters. There can be much more things to say. Temporary existence in Ubudiyya, yes. I mean, we are temporary in this world, and our real life is in Akhirah. We believe that. I mean, inshallah, we hope to go to the good side of the division there in Akhirah. But I think in our temporary life, we need sustenance, we need certain things, and I think we need freedom to be able to be Muslims in the way we want. Freedom from the governments, freedom from the people who might impose on us on their things. So freedom is yes, temporary existence, but that temporary existence has requirements. Justice is one of those, and their justice and freedom are closely related. So that's why it's not unimportant. Dr. Anbar Ahmed mentioned, let's come to issues of capitalism or free markets, and which didn't go well, I think, to some of our colleagues here, which is very understandable. Dr. Anbar Ahmed said, let's not forget that the modern economic system created an ecological crisis in the world today. I mean, the global warming and other things. And this comes a lot. I mean, Muslims say, you're speaking about modern liberal capitalist civilization, and look at all the disasters of pollution and global warming and all that. I'll say, well, we have those ecological problems, not because of capitalism per se, but because of industrialization. Soviet Union was pretty brutal on the nature as well, and they harmed the ecology pretty big time in the Aral Lake and other places. Look at Chernobyl. I mean, it's the world's greatest nuclear disaster. So, I mean, with industrialization, human societies acquired a power that they didn't have before, right? And now with nuclear and everything, it is going on. Now, you can make an argument for a pre-industrial world. That's a different thing. But once you're industrial, I mean, you will pollute the world, even if you are the Soviet Union or the United States or China or the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, if you establish factories and have nuclear facilities, and if you drive cars, and by the way, our ummah has been giving the biggest source of fossil fuel to this modern civilization. So there are ecological problems in the world that we should care about and talk about, but it's not a mere, I mean, when we replace Islamic, let's say, capitalism with socialism, I mean, it's not going to go away. North Korea will not be more environment friendly. Or when we have Islamic states, I mean, they will not stop driving cars. So I just want to highlight that point. I mean, it's a problem. I mean, capitalism is consumerism, so there are a lot of things to criticize, but it's a matter of industrialization more than anything else. And let me come to the points of other economy by our friend. Is it Dr. Fawaz Shaheen? Is that correct? Sorry if I'm getting it. Dr. Fawaz Shaheen.
Yeah, doctor. Yeah, just missed.
Okay, inshallah, soon, inshallah. And to our brother Fawaz, again, thanks for reminding the situation in India. And I think India is a good way of seeing that why ideas of freedom, including religious freedom, are necessary for us Muslims, and we have to defend them. And we have to defend them in France, we have to defend them in China, we have to defend them in India. And we have to also respect them when we go to the other side of the border in Pakistan, where Pakistani minorities are also complaining from lack of freedom in their country. You're quite right about monopolization and the destructive elements of capitalism. I mean, the East India Company was the driving force behind colonialization of Southeast Asia. There's a terrible state there. But I think these things happen when capitalism becomes strongly allied with the state. It becomes state capitalism and uses state for brutal mechanisms like war and conquest. But that's why, I mean, I emphasize just the market idea, the idea that there should be free markets and free exchange and companies. If those companies turn monopolies, they generally turn monopolies because they ally with the state. they use state resources to get advantages for themselves or disadvantage other companies. In a truly, I think, free market society, monopolies are, you can bring anti-monopoly laws, but monopolies generally are challenged by other companies who do things better. Is it terrible to have something like Amazon? I don't know. I mean, Amazon brings goods to people and employs a lot of people, and people are happy that they get goods from services like that. And there are alternatives to these things as well, I think, in capitalist societies. That's why, unless the government is involved and favors one group to another. So a lot of the criticisms that can be brought to capitalism today, it's because of state capitalism, which is also the model in China. In China, moved to capitalism, but not to a freedom, not to political freedom, for sure. So there is companies associated with the state, and that is the problem. Inheritance, yes, that's true. And Timur Kuran has written about that. And I think we should only be proud that we have an egalitarian, actually, inheritance system in Islam, although it was not fully egalitarian between the genders. But I think it's a historical situation that could be reinterpreted. When it comes to you, Fawaz, you mentioned that land in Europe, land is owned by aristocracies for many centuries, and Europe. That is true, but some people see that there is some blessing in that, because the alternative of that was the land was owned by the state, like in the Ottoman Empire, and it was given to people as ikta, or as a temporary form of borrowing and lending. And when the state owns it, then you have a very powerful state, and you don't have, the state controls resources, which leads to incredible nepotism and corruption. And that's why Ottoman reformers in the 19th century, including economic reformers, actually brought a law of private ownership of the land, which I think was important. And in what happened in Turkey in the modern era is that the private ownership of the land moved on, but the state still became very involved in the economy, and state capitalism and nepotism developed in Turkey. So I don't see the private ownership of the land as a problem. Monopoly is something else. And there are many things that can be said about critiques of modern day capitalism. In all of these issues I'm speaking about, I think you can bring criticisms. But this book is trying to give some ideas to Muslims who are thinking about these issues, saying that, hey, listen, the world is not that black and white. When people speak about capitalism, if it means private property and free market and voluntary exchange, that is not alien to us. We actually built some of these things because from our religious tradition, and actually Europe learned some of these things from us. And in my earlier book, for example, Reopening Minds, I mean, I showed how the novel Hay bin Yakzan, written by Ibn Tufayl, influenced some Enlightenment thinkers. So some of the Enlightenment ideas actually came from Islam, which will allow us to look into these things, I think, in a more less black and white way. Zulkarnain said, I use Islamist or Islamism in a negative term. Apologies if this was in any way offensive. I mean, I'm critical of the idea that religion and state should be infused, and the state should uphold and therefore impose one interpretation of Islam. That's what generally what Islamists, the people we call Islamists, believe. I have no doubt about that sincerity. I've been an Islamist myself in my, I think in early 90s, my ideas evolved over time. But it was not, I mean, I think we can discuss. I mean, there Islamists are people who generally think that the state should be defined by Islam, and actually building an Islamic state should be even the first goal, the primary goal, I think, of Islamic movements. Whereas you can say building an Islamic society is the primary goal, building an Islamic individual ethic character is the primary goal. So there are differences here. So I use that to be critical of that. If you are not critical of that or you're supportive of that, I would respect, but then, you know, we would have a question. We would have a conversation on that. On the corporal punishments and context issue, Zulkarnain, you raised, one can defend corporal punishments, but what my question is, there is something interesting. The Quran gives corporal punishments always. There is one about women who do fakhsha being in their homes, held in their homes. But home, yes, you can hold in their homes, but that's not a formal prison. And we know that there were no formal prisons in Mecca or Medina in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, because it was not a social order. I mean, it's a city-state, small place where you don't have a central authority. Prisons were not an established thing at the time. Prisons came later in Islam, when Islam turned into a bigger state during the time of Caliph Umar, as we know, and I quote that sources. So the question is, when Quran gives corporal punishments, is it related something with the context? And we also know from historical sources, from Islam, from Muslim sources, that Arabs of pre-Islamic Arabs, Jahiliya Arabs, were also amputating hands for theft. So my sense is that Quranic legislation, which is important and crucial for us, and we deeply respect, but it took place in a social setting. The social setting was 7th century Arabia. So some of the things about women, men doing zihar against their women, something you will not maybe hear anymore, but it was there in that society. The Quran legislated what was there in that society and based on that conditions. And therefore I subscribe to the view of Fazlur Rahman Malik, who was an important scholar from Pakistan. He later lived in late life in America. He had this idea of a double movement, that we should go back to the Quran, see its context, look at the intention, the maqsad of Quranic injunctions, verdicts. And when we come back to the modern era, we might reinterpret them somehow. And that would be, for example, on issues of inheritance between men and women. I think the Quran, by giving women half of the inheritance, gave a very generous amount in 7th century society, when men were always responsible of taking care of the family. But in a modern social setting where the economic conditions have changed, can we reinterpret this? My answer is yes, based on the scholars that I mentioned in the book and other books. But again, that's not a must, and a Muslim woman can say, I'll just get my share, half of it is, as is in the Quran, and I'll respect that. I think the governments should not legislate that and leave it to individuals and communities to make their decisions on these issues of inheritance and other things that relate to religious practice. So this is what I have in mind based on what I've written here. But if you want to extend more with other additional points, and we can, if there's something that I forgot, please remind me, or but this is what I was able to gather based on the very valuable thoughts that I heard from our colleagues here. Again, thank you to all, and this was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mustafa Akyol. We are really indebted to you. You accepted our request to conduct the book discussion on your book, and you gave your valuable time and listened to all the discussions by our expert and learned speakers, and you responded to them. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear speakers, Dr. A.K. Muneer, Madam Ambar Ahmad, and Brother Fawaz Shaheen. The book, as we saw, is in fact a collection of so many views where modern Muslim scholarship disagreed with the tradition. And it was great, in fact, to discuss so many issues at one meeting. But at the same time, it was also impossible to exhaust the discussion. I'm sure the discussion would have been more fruitful, meaningful, and enjoyable had we had time to exchange the views and interacted more. But due to the lack of time and format which we have adopted for this series, we'll stop here. But I hope this was just one episode among many where we will keep engaging and interacting and learning from each other and sharing our thoughts. I'm thankful to all the participants who joined us in this wonderful discussion. And let me emphasize again here that this discussion is very special in the sense that we'll keep bringing very different kinds of books and authors and speakers to offer the platforms to discuss and engage with each other without subscribing to any particular view or endorsing any particular idea. So the whole idea of this book discussion series, in fact, to avoid to make conclusion and judgment, and to keep engaging and problematize more and more, and celebrate the complexities of the issues in the world. We are living in a very complex world where we need to keep thinking and engaging without going into dogmatism and absolutism. So thank you again, all of you from SIU of India. Looking forward to have another book discussion, inshallah, with wonderful people and interesting book. So thank you again, all of you.
Thank you,
Jazakumullah
Dr.
khairan.
Akyol. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored by this conversation, really.
I'm looking
personally.
forward to reading your other works. Your writing is extremely engaging and it raises extremely pertinent questions, and looking forward to learning more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to learning more from you. So please stay in touch and send me your own works and writings and whatever you can like to share. I'm really honored. And I know that some of my ideas sound a little bit too liberal or too unorthodox, but I'm not claiming to have figured out everything right. But this is, as a Muslim who's worried about these issues and thinking about this is what I've come at this point. And I think at least these are the discussions we should have. So I appreciate, and I know that some of the people in the audience may be more conservative or maybe more skeptical about these issues. I appreciate the fact that you have shown the courage and the principled stance of having this discussion. Thanks, shukran, and jazakallah khair.
Thank you so much, Mustafa Akyol.
Okay, thank you too.
Yeah, I hope the conversation will continue. Yeah.
Yes, inshallah. Just one thing, Dr. Muneer, hope you read the last chapter, Why is Liberalism a Western Conspiracy, or something like that.
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
But my question remains.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, inshallah, we'll discuss over tea or coffee sometime, inshallah, in the future.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, so session ends here.